The anime begins in a place called the Labyrinth of the Moon's Reflection, where an adventurer, Rentt Faina, found himself paralyzed after encountering a dragon. He thought it was the end, but later was surprised to realize he was still alive. However, upon looking at his reflection in the water, he discovers that he has somehow been transformed into an undead. Before this incident, Rentt had gotten up early that day because for him, only nobles, wealthy merchants, and perhaps scholars with rule-free lives sleep in late. His studious friend, for instance, forgets to sleep for days when focused on research. Rentt was born and raised in a small town not even on maps and currently is a bronze-class adventurer. Like every adventurer, he wakes up early to get good jobs at the Adventurers Guild, which offers tasks based on everyone's skills and class, including monster extermination, escort plant and material collection, and even clearing clogged ducts. Rentt greets some adventurers at the guild, reviews the day's jobs, but not finding any interesting, decides to continue exploring the labyrinth of the moon's reflection, as he used to do. Unlike most adventurers, Rentt worked alone, not being very skilled, belonging to the second lowest class despite being an adventurer for 10 years, counting training before that, totaling 20 years. Despite this, he managed to make a living by hunting monsters and selling magical stones and other materials to the guild, being cautious and having an emergency fund. And so, Rentt stops by the market to buy bread and then heads to the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. However, unlike other times he entered to explore, that day he found a secret passage, getting excited about the discovery and the idea of exploring an uncharted area, acting without any prudence, something essential for any adventurer. He explores the place hoping to find magical items and valuable weapons, but thinks he should earn some money at the guild just by reporting that secret passage. However, instead of going back, Rentt moves forward, ignoring the fact that he is entering a very suspicious and dangerous area. As we know, instead of finding valuable items and weapons, he comes face to face with the biggest monster he has ever seen, recognizing it as a dragon, although he had never seen one before. According to legend, dragons are creatures that can have many forms and sizes, and when Rentt faces such a monster, he can't move his body, being paralyzed because he knew that a simple solo adventurer of the bronze class wouldn't be able to face such an exceptional creature as a dragon. And so he becomes an undead and immortal monster, although easily destroyed by a bishop or priest through purification magic, due to being a creature that violates the divine providence that the dead should not remain in that world. Rentt wonders if that meant he had died, but since he still had consciousness and memory, he decides to keep hope and return to the city. However, upon further thought, Rentt realizes that it's a terrible idea. After all, an undead would surely be eliminated as soon as it showed up in the city, and despite already being dead, he didn't want to be destroyed. Rentt becomes desperate and unsure of what to do, but decides to stay calm and not lose his head, pondering over something that has no answer. Then he takes his sword and notices that the dragon has disappeared, but thinks it's better to leave that place anyway. And so Rentt continues through the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. These labyrinths are found all over the world and researched by scholars wanting to explain their mysteries because no one knows for sure where they came from and how they work, knowing only that there are various ones of different sizes and are places where magical items and hidden treasures can be found, as well as monsters that appear everywhere. Rentt noticed that the place was empty and deduced it was because the other adventurers must be in the labyrinth of the new moon, which pays more than the labyrinth of the lunar reflection. So he thought he just needed to wait for a few days for another lonely adventurer like him to appear with whom he could converse. However, with this, Rentt realized that being a skeleton, he couldn't speak at all. At that moment, another undead appeared, but it was just a monster like any other. So Rentt prepared to face the creature, but he realized that due to the lack of muscles, he was much weaker and would lose even to an ordinary person. Because of this, Rentt decided to face the skeleton carefully, but when he raised his sword, he fell, discovering that in that form he couldn't even lift his weapon. Rentt became desperate seeing the skeleton approach him, but fortunately, the creature fell on its own and lost a leg. The adventurer watched the skeleton trying to fit its leg back in place and thought that obviously a skeletal undead with only bones couldn't use sword techniques. This reminded Rentt that all living beings could use life energy to gain strength. He then activated his spiritual energy, finding out that he could use it even in that form, gaining enough strength to use his sword, returning to the fight just in time for the skeleton to fit its leg. And so Rentt easily defeated his opponent with a sword strike. Suddenly, a light appeared, illuminating the adventurer and the skeleton, and he realized he was recovering the spiritual energy he had just used. This reminded Rentt of a conversation he had with his friend. She said that monsters have a mysterious characteristic and that with time and experience they grow even more. The adventurer observed that humans also evolve as they gain experience, But his friend clarified that the scale is different, giving an example of a skeleton that in rare occasions can become ghouls, a process called existential evolution, one of the subjects she usually studies. Ghouls are also undead, with the difference that they have flesh and are more similar to humans, making Rentt think that with a cloak and a mask to hide his new form, he could possibly return to the city. And so Rentt sets a new goal, to become a ghoul, for which he needed to defeat monsters in the labyrinth until achieving existential evolution. Meanwhile, his researcher friend gives up waiting for Rentt and decides to make dinner alone. The adventurer continues defeating skeletons in the labyrinth, improving his mobility with the light, which he deduces has a healing effect, allowing him to use his spiritual energy in every fight. Then Rentt decides to try facing a slightly stronger monster. After searching a bit, he finds a slime, a creature weak like skeletons, but not to be underestimated because physical attacks are less effective against amorphous and liquid monsters, like it easier to defeat with magic. However, he doesn't have enough skill to use attack magic, so the most he can do is use utility magic to create fire. That means Rentt has to defeat the slime only with physical attacks. For this, there are two options: hit the creature's core or shred its liquid form to the point where it can't regenerate. However, he neither has the strength nor the skill for that, leaving only the option to spend his reserve of spiritual energy once a day, making the small slime almost like an archenemy for Rentt. The monster tries to attack, but the undead dodges, and luckily, Rentt hits its core on the first strike. Then he takes the magic stone and collects the slime's liquid in a flask because the monster can release an acidic bomb. However, after they are defeated, the acid disappears from their bodies and the liquid leaves the skin smooth, making the content usable for cosmetics. Rentt gathered all the liquid using various vials he carried with him and thought that everyone should pay for a few days at the inn. The next day, a girl named Sheila, who worked at the Adventurers Guild, carried out her duties as usual. A teammate asked if the new adventurer who had come by had managed to find a group because, based on the recommendation letter, she didn't seem to have much real experience despite being skilled with a sword. Sheila explained that there were no good openings for the girl, so she thought of asking for Rentt's help. However, since he didn't show up, she told the novice that she would introduce her to a considerate veteran if she waited for a few days. But as the girl mentioned needing money, Sheila informed her about the Labyrinth of the lunar reflection. The man thinks Sheila did well because, being skilled with a sword, the girl should manage well in the labyrinth, even as a novice. Sheila cautioned her not to overdo it. Her teammate found it strange that Rentt hadn't shown up and asked if he had taken any long-term jobs. Sheila denied it, explaining that there was nothing that would make the adventurer leave Malt. Meanwhile, Rentt noticed that he no longer felt the desire to eat or sleep, which made sense as he was now undead, and attempting to eat would only result in the food falling to the ground. He observed that despite facing many monsters, existential evolution takes time. Although his abilities had decreased when he transformed into a skeleton, he was almost back to his previous level, thanks to the defeated monsters. Rentt discovered that, in addition to his spiritual energy, he could also use mana and divine energy, even as an undead. He used the energy on the bread he bought in the city because, besides healing wounds and illnesses, it was useful for purifying water and slowing down the decay of food, allowing the bread to last for at least 3 more days. Hoping that after this time he would have a body that needed nourishment, Rentt decided to focus on achieving existential evolution by defeating monsters gradually and safely. He could handle up to 2 at the same time, but a group of 3 would complicate things, and if there were 4, he would have to flee. A group of 5 would be almost impossible to encounter in the labyrinth. Rentt hoped not to encounter such a large group since, in that case, it would be his end, as he lacked strength in spiritual and divine energy and had little mana. Despite not being naturally inclined to be an adventurer, he didn't give up, unlike most people who tend to leave the adventurer's life after a few years and return to the village for fieldwork or other tasks. Rentt trained hard every day, studied magic and monsters with his friend, and accepted any job, no matter how small, believing he would achieve his dream as long as he survived. 10 years later, he was still far from becoming a mithril-class adventurer, a class that had saved nations and surpassed gold and platinum levels, even eluding those with innate talent. Nevertheless, Rentt refused to give up on his dream, even though he had become a skeleton. So he faced the labyrinth monsters again, realizing he was stronger than when he was human. He encountered a slime, dodging its attacks and easily hitting its core, reinforcing his belief that he was getting stronger. Rentt decided to collect more materials to sell, thinking he was fortunate to find another clean slime because they become disgusting after absorbing something, making it impossible to sell the liquid in those cases. But suddenly, the light appears, causing Rentt to absorb his spiritual energy once again. However, unlike the previous times, he begins to feel something strange, and before he knows it, he was gaining flesh. Finally, Rentt manages to undergo existential evolution and becomes a ghoul, acquiring an appearance similar to that of a zombie, which he considers a significant advancement. Rentt thinks that if he keeps striving, perhaps he'll become an undead of a higher class, like vampires who are practically indistinguishable from humans. So now that he has more than just bones, Rentt attempts to speak, but all he manages are some strange sounds. However, he doesn't get discouraged and continues training. Next week, we'll have more of this anime as soon as the new episode is released, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the like button below to support this video. See you guys.